Boys and girls, your attention, please. The Blank Corporation presents a brand new radio program featuring the thrilling adventures of an amazing and incredible personality. Faster than an airplane, more powerful than a locomotive, impervious to bullets. Up in the sky! Look!
It's a giant bird!
It's an airplane! It's...
Welcome back to Vox Popcast, the weekly pseudo-academic roundtable of pop culture analysis with drinking and swearing. My name is Christopher Maverick, but you can call me Mav, and I am once again here with my co-host, Wayne Wise. How's it going, Wayne?
Good. How are you, Mav?
I'm doing good. We're not doing a New Year's show today.
We're not. We're not.
It's 3 weeks of New Year's shows.
We've kind of drove that into the ground.
That's right. So we've got a new topic. I don't know if I remember how to do this. But did I ever really?
Yeah.
You were teasing me before the show that I was going to mess up the intro, and I did not. I just I nailed that.
You did not. We'll make a note of that.
That's right. One take. But anyway, one of the things that's weird about this show, you and I are both comic book guys, as it were. Like that's kind of like our role. And we do very few comic book shows.
Yeah. And initially, when we first started talking about this in the comic shop, that was sort of where we started was we stand here and talk about comics every week. We should do a podcast of this, or someone told us we should do a podcast of this. And then it very quickly expanded to include everything else
in pop culture,
which I'm okay
design.
With. I'm absolutely fine with that.
But people actually ask every once in a while, how come you don't do more comic shows? And so
because everyone else does.
Yeah. We thought we'd do one this week. It'd be interesting. And as regular listeners will notice, neither Hannah nor Katya could make it this week. So we invited guests like we always do. So first, I want to welcome back, returning our very first guest ever on the Vox Popcast, John Darowski. How's it going, John?
I'm doing fine. Glad to be back.
Hey, welcome back, John.
Welcome.
Thanks.
And also joining us for the first time, friend of ours from the same place I know John, from the pop culture academic circuit, Anna Peppard. Hey, Anna.
Very nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for joining us.
Yeah. So here's where the idea for this show came from. If you listen to this show regularly, you know that I am working on my dissertation. Working on my dissertation means I bang my head at a wall a lot and I complain about whatever I'm writing about, usually on Twitter. If you follow me on Twitter, you'll see that. But at one point, I was complaining about Golden Age comics, and the two of you both responded to it.
I remember this.
Yeah, and I was like, well, that should be a show.
You posted something very negative about early Superman, and it made me sad, and I had to respond. And I'm not a big Facebook participator, so it takes a lot for me to respond.
I don't know what I said exactly. It was probably something snide. I know recently on the show I was talking about Silver Age comics, not Golden Age comics, and I said something to the effect of, the Silver Age of comics went from 1955 to 1970 roughly, and in that time hundreds of thousands of comic books were published, and not a single one of them is good.
Oh my goodness.
I am a big fan of them. But and I don't know that I would say that about the Golden Age. There's some stuff in the Golden Age that I legitimately love, but I'm trying to decide, do I think any of them are good? Can I recommend them to somebody who's not a comic fan? I think some I could.
Well, yeah, and I ran into that just in my role as a retailer. People coming in and wanting to read they saw the Spider-Man movie and they want to come in and read Spider-Man, and you hand them the essential volume or the epic collection of those first few stories. And if they have been worn anytime since 1962, they really don't get it. Like the pacing is so different, even though those stories are there. And I have this tremendous fondness, not that I was reading it in 1962 either, but, it's not necessarily the best place to start if you've never read comics before.
I will concede it's not the best place to start. I mean,
Right.
that'll get us like really into sort of what our attachments are to these older comics. And one of the things I was thinking about was that I don't know if I'd appreciate Golden Age comics as much as I do, which, it's not like I'm a huge fan, but I do appreciate a number of them. Unless I was sort of a superhero, sort of ACA fan first. Because I did sort of, become a fan of like contemporary comics and then Silver Age comics, and then went back and sort of read a bunch of Golden Age stuff for teaching and scholarship purposes. And, I don't know if I'd have the same reaction if I just like approached it like, the first Superman comics I read were like Golden Age superhero comics.
Yeah,
so
and that's it. Same here. I don't really go back, and I'm not working on a dissertation. I don't go back and go, ooh, I really want to sit down and read All Winter Squad for the next week.
Yeah. Gonna be a lot of racial caricatures.
I have that historic appreciation for it and a certain love of seeing the development of that stuff and how that took place.
Yeah.
But that's very different than just like, ooh, I really enjoy this as a work of art or whatever.
Yeah, you might not need to look at it as a work of art, but more as an artifact.
Yes.
It's from a time and place, but it built this other thing that we appreciate now.
Yeah. And I love teaching that stuff in my pop culture history class, just kind of using that as a lens to talk about the war and what was going on in America. And, I use it to talk about propaganda. And from there, I lead into racial stereotypes. And, so I find it very rich as a teaching tool. But I haven't assigned them to read All Winter Squad.
Well, I think John's calling it an artifact is really good because this is sort of one of those weeks where I really do wish Hannah was here because she'll joke all the time.
These rare weeks? Did I hear that?
No, not rare. Oh my God, she's not here. Suddenly this show's just going to be about Riverdale. But
sure, I'm happy with that too.
I'm a huge Riverdale fan. But no, Hannah will often say that, she makes fun of her time period. Hannah's a Victorianist. So everything that she reads professionally is 200, 300 years old. And she knows that they are problematic in many, many ways, that if this is the first thing that you have ever read and you're starting in 2020, it's going to be weird. And we're not going back that far, but the world was a very different place in 1939. and we had different cultural sensibilities. And I really do believe that picking up an Action Comics #1, Detective 27, those tell you something about the world.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, one of the things I really like about sort of consuming older popular culture, and, I watch a lot of old TV and that kind of stuff too. And I just find it's a connection between you and that time. And, I mean, my dad grew up reading, Black Hawk comics and Captain Marvel and talks to me about it. And, it's a connection to where people were in that place and time. And especially sort of the first few years of superhero comics just make me very excited. I mean, seeing people kind of throw everything against the wall and play with this new concept of the superhero is just, I find it super exciting. But again, I am approaching it as like an ACA fan, right? Someone who loves the superhero genre, loves studying the superhero genre. So to go back and see how some of the themes are there right at the beginning is super exciting to me.
And just the sheer wackiness of it. What you're saying, that let's throw everything against the wall. Here, I'm the red bee. My superpowers, I keep bees in my belt.
I was reading a great one on Digital Comics Museum a few weeks ago that was the moth. Either of you guys encountered that one? He wears like a moth costume and it's sort of like green brown. It's very attractive.
No, I haven't. I'll have to look that up.
I might have encountered an article about it, but I'm struggling to recall it.
Wow.
Have you seen the books, like the Regrettable Heroes? I think there have been 2 volumes of them. That just some of those are marvelous.
They are good.
I want to throw in just, my anecdote of Little Wayne discovering the Golden Age. I couldn't tell you what grade I was in, but I was reading comics as a kid. Like I literally don't remember not reading comics. So it's always been there. And I'm older than you guys. So late 60s, early 70s. And we got one of those catalogs in school from Scholastic where you can order books. And there was a book called All in Color for a Dime.
Oh, yeah. I know that.
No, that's surprising it went in there.
Yeah, and that's it. So early 70s, whenever that book came out. And it was about comics. And I ordered my paperback copy of All in Color for a Dime, which is probably has led me to the path that we are here today.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the book that started my path for this.
This set in order a chain of events that would one day result.
And I read that when I was 10, 11, 12 years old or whatever. And, it's a collection of essays about old comics and not necessarily academic, but it certainly was.
Some of them are. I have a copy of that somewhere.
Yeah. And that was the first place in my life that I was consciously aware of, wait a minute, there were comics before I was alive? Oh, my God, I will never have the opportunity to read these.
Yeah, well.
Yeah, and here I am. But after that, I became aware of things like the DC 100-page spectaculars, and in the Treasury editions, they would reprint some of those stories. Like I had the Treasury edition of Action Comics #1, so I read that Speed Saunders story and the Zatara story. And
yeah, we should come to that in a second. But before we do, just because Action, for anybody, we sort of started in the middle because we're us, right?
Yeah, right.
but for people who might be unfamiliar with the terms, we should define what Golden Age is.
That'd probably be helpful.
Yeah, when the Golden Age of comics becomes, because it's sort of weird. Like if you hear the term Golden Age of comics, you would assume, and you knew nothing. I assume you'd think that it was either when the first comic started, which is not true, or you would assume it is the best age of comics. Also not, arguably not true. That's debatable. But we should define when the Golden Age is.
I think this is a good question because a lot of what the context we've been putting it in is superheroes.
Yeah.
Right, but it's not just superheroes.
Yes. Right. We have the Golden Age of superheroes.
Yeah.
We also have the Golden Age of comics, and they're really two different things.
But they overlap.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Absolutely. They overlap. But as comic book academics, more superhero academics, we always think in terms of the superhero timeline. And kind of have blinders on everything else that was going on. And a lot of the histories you find about comic books focus on the superheroes. And so we should acknowledge all the other stuff that was going on and were part of this Golden Age.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and part of why it's called the Golden Age of comics is because it was the most popular, it was the height of comics popularity in America, right? And then when you have comics go, then you have the dip in popularity that happens after that, and they've never really recovered that popularity. So that's part of where, the kind of nostalgic label of Golden Age kind of comes into play.
Mm-hmm. So, roughly speaking, usually... With some variance depending on who you talk to, the Golden Age is probably the one that is easiest to pinpoint for probably most scholars and most fans. But roughly speaking, we're talking about 1938 to 1955.
Well, that's one of the questions I wanted to bring up in this discussion because 38 is when we have the introduction of Superman, but you had about at least 5 years of comics before then, at least.
Yeah. Well, you had 5 years of comics as we know comics before then, and if you include strips, you've got 100 years.
Yeah,
and
strips is a whole different ball game.
Yeah. And if you include everything McLeod counts, you've McLeod or our friend Chris Gobbler counts. You go back to the dawn of time.
We're talking about the format of the comic book.
Yeah,
as we know it, the pamphlet format.
Yeah, famous funnies.
Funnies number
one. Yeah, and so do you want to start in 1933, or do you want to start with superheroes? And some people call what became before superheroes the Platinum Age. Yeah, this gets into the minutia and it gets very granular, which is a lot of fun for scholars, but maybe not for everyone else.
Yeah, I guess I've heard the term Platinum Age. I guess in my mind, I kind of start from famous funnies and just certainly the success of Superman and Action Comics launched the industry into the making millions of dollars. But as you say, there was a good 4 or 5 years before that where comics were coming out
famous
and being
funnies published in 34. So yes.
Yeah. So we have there were detective stories and crime stories, and a lot of the stuff that was coming out in the comics at that time were mirroring what was happening in pulps and magazines, detective magazines and muscle magazines
and radio shows,
romance magazines and radio shows. So yes, there was it was successful. They were continuing to be published to make money before Superman happened, but Superman certainly launched it into a whole different, stratosphere.
Mm-hmm.
So in my brain, I tend to think of the Golden Age incorporating all of that. Mm-hmm. Platinum does certainly separate it from the advent of the superhero.
But I think that separation it's convenient because like if you get to 1938, 1939, pretty much all of us are going to agree we're in the Golden Age. There might be some rough things like there's before Famous Funnies. We always say Famous Funnies is this first comic. But there's a book called
Funnies on Parade was the first one.
Yeah, and there. I mean, so are we talking about 1935, 34?
This is the whole debate.
The Funnies is 29. Yeah,
right.
And I don't know that we need to do that here.
Yeah,
but somewhere in the 30s through roughly speaking, I like to say 1955. So for me, the end of the Golden Age is the foundation of the Comics Code Authority, which we've talked about briefly on other shows.
Subcommittee hearings in 54, and then the code first appeared in 55.
Right. So, which changes the way comic books look, not just in superheroes, but also by that time, superheroes weren't even popular anymore. So by that time, you're talking about horror comics and romance comics, detective crime comics, true crime comics. Those are all.
And then you have a resurgence of superheroes in part because of the code kind of damaging those other genres. So, then we talk about the Silver Age being the reintroduction of the Flash, which was the first kind of big superhero reintroduction in the post-code era. And that's when the Silver Age starts.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So those are roughly the time period we're talking about. I actually find it interesting when I took my when I was doing my my PhD exams, which for people who don't know how exams work, if you've never done a PhD, at some point during your PhD, after you're done with classes, before you write your dissertation, there's a period where people make you read 100 books, and then they stick you in a room and they make you answer questions till they get sick of asking you questions.
and for a lot of people that I know that went through for literature, including myself, it makes you hate reading.
Yes.
I've never read novels for real enjoyment since then.
Yes, it is the part. It's academic hazing. It is the part of the PhD process where we crush your spirits and make you hate what you love. And we all do it. So at the point where I was doing mine, we got to the part where we were discussing my specialization of superheroes and comic books, and they were asking me questions, and without thinking about it, I had used terms Golden Age, Silver Age, Bronze Age, Modern Age. And at some point, one of my professors, someone who's not a comic book scholar, but was on my exam committee, says to me, I have a question for you. And it's like, that's what we're here for. And he said, okay, you say Golden Age, Silver Age, Modern Age, Bronze Age. And I was like, well, and I was like, yeah, something like that. And got him out of order. But he's like, okay, why? Like, when is you talk about the modern age? To him, he was like, modern age means the 1900s to about 1945. And I was like, no, I'm starting in 1985. And he's like, you just said that. Like, and I was like, sure. He goes, well, are these defined? And I was like, roughly. And he says, well, when are the ages? And I just off the top of my head said, 1935-ish to 55 to 70 to 85 to now. And he's like, how do you know that? Is that written down somewhere? And it's like, no, it's just, he's like, well, where'd you learn that? And it's like, I've known that since I was 7. Well, not quite. I mean, the bronze, the modern age didn't happen until I was
started
10.
Right.
Yeah. But I was like, yeah, I've known that since, and he's like, well, like, where's that? And his question is like, where's that written down? And I was just like, I don't know. We all kind of feel that. And it's something that we take for granted as comic scholars. and even as dedicated comic fans. Like it's not just an academic term. If you are listening to this show and you're just a big comic book nerd, you're like, why are they discussing this? Everybody knows this. Apparently everybody doesn't. So that's why we're going over.
But actually, I've run into this a number of times where, you have to cite a definitive source for that stuff. And, a lot of different people talk about it, obviously, but like in terms of like the definitive source, it's kind of hard.
Mm-hmm. So I've actually been writing about this topic for my dissertation as I'm writing on my portion on the history of superheroes. And there's this vague sense that in the 60s, as fan culture was building up and they had all the fanzines and were starting to move towards the conventions, they were looking to codify. And it seems like by the time you get the Overstreet price guide is when you start having those errors established clearly.
Okay. Yeah.
That makes sense.
I remember I first encountered these terms in Wizard, the comics magazine, because they had a price guide and they had it divided by ages. And I had no idea what those meant at the time, but that was my first encounter with them, was more on the economic side.
Yeah.
Of how much the comics cost versus the
and they function
content
partly
in
that
the
way
history.
too, right? Because it is legitimizing force, right? So that is tied up in the collector market for sure.
I am curious where the terms first appeared, though. And once again, this gets into academic questions. Like it doesn't matter to the general audience. But
well, it goes John, you might know ancient Greeks with Hesiod and Ovid.
I have seen people trying to trace it and say that they've seen it, and like there are instances where people started using them zines and in letter columns,
pages,
where there were people saying stuff like, it wasn't something people were saying during the Golden Age, but definitely during the Silver Age, with the reemergence of the Flash and Hawkman or reemergence of the new Flash, the new Green Lantern, the reemergence of Hawkman. There are people saying stuff like, wow, it's like we've entered a Silver Age of comics. There was a Golden Age. Yeah. So they were definitely aware that they were at a different point by the Silver Age.
In some ways, it sounds like such a Stan Lee, like bringing back Captain America, one of the heroes of the Golden Age, just that bombast that he does.
He almost certainly did that.
Yeah, I'm sure he did certainly that. Now, whether
not even four people in a writer's meeting, he Stan absolutely says true believers, because I'm sure he called it like everybody. He knew
everybody in the office that.
It's modeled after other nostalgias too. Like film nostalgia, for instance, and
yes,
Golden Age of Hollywood. Yes,
because I have to believe that All in Color for a Dime referred to it as the Golden Age when I was reading that. I just can't imagine.
It seems like by the 70s there was some codification going on.
Yeah.
That was generally agreed upon. You would not going to find, here's where it was first written down and how they divided the ages. It's not like they got a committee together and decided these things.
Right.
It was fans.
Today they would.
Today they would. It was fans communicating through fanzines or at conventions, talking to retailers. And we should also say in the 70s, that's when they started to move comics off the newsstand to the specialty shops.
Yeah.
And those retailers probably wanted some way to organize stuff.
Yeah.
And so that's where this, it just bubbled up at that period.
So jumping back 10, 15 minutes or whatever, pointing out that there's genres other than the superhero in the 1940s. So we should probably touch on that. What other genres were there? What else was going on other than superheroes?
It's not just that there were other genres. Superheroes weren't even the dominant genre. Like they definitely, there were titles that were very popular. Superman, Captain Marvel, now known as Shazam, in case you want, anyone's not familiar with that story. But
Superman, Captain Marvel, Captain America, Wonder Woman, Batman are by far more popular superheroes than anybody else. There are other Captain Marvel Jr. and Mary Marvel's books as well.
Yeah. So, but those are kind of outliers to all the
Red
superheroes
Bee was
that
not
produced.
that popular,
and all those other heroes didn't sell nearly as much as many of these other genres.
And when they did, it was on and off. You'd have they had their fans, but what was
they kept their publication, so someone was buying.
Right. They at least from National Publications, which became DC Comics, and Timely Publications, which became Timely Marvel /
Atlas.
Marvel Comics has a fascinating back history of changing its name by the week to avoid taxes. I mean, it is a dark, horrible history of really shady business practices. But they were also publishing Captain America and Human Torch and Namor the Submariner. And these comics were popular in that they sort of maintained, whereas there are a lot of Golden Age heroes that would exist for 6 months to 18 months and then just be done. Many of them,
and a lot of the comics, a lot of the comics like Action were anthologies as well. You'd have an 8-page Superman story with multiple genres all in the same book.
Right. And that's what I wanted to get to, because we were talking about one of the things that I find interesting is if you go and you find republications of Action Comics #1 today, a lot of times it's just that Superman story. If you look it up on the DC Universe app, it's just that Superman story, which is like 12 pages of very loosely related content because it was intended to be a newspaper strip, and they just they sold it for $150. And there's the history of Superman is weird, but that first Superman story itself, especially, is not very coherent in a lot of ways. And the other comics in Action #1 are there's a Killer Zatara story in it.
Yeah. I always encourage students to read those extra stories when I'm teaching that comic, because I give them the full one, and I don't know that they ever do, but I do encourage them to.
I love Zatara.
Zatara.
Zatara, for fans of modern comics, is Zatanna. It's her father, but he first appears in Action Comics #1, the same comic that was the first appearance of Superman. And he did not end up being as famous, though I do think he's great.
And there was Speed Saunders, who was an adventurer.
Speed Saunders isn't. Yep. And there's some westerns in there.
Yeah. And in some of the modern versions, Hawkwoman is a descendant of Speed Saunders.
You can kind of see, though, from the other stuff that's included in some of those anthologies, where there'll be one superhero story and sort of a number of other stories, that a lot of those other stories will be modeled sort of after pulps, right? Either pulp novels or radio shows and things. So you can see why we link the Golden Age to the superhero, because the superhero is something new. It's something that is germane to the comics medium. And that's why we tie it to the success of the comics medium, right? So it's you're saying that those other stories seem more polished. And I think that makes sense, because those are based on kind of an established genre, whereas, Superman, they're trying to figure this dang thing out. And that's why it's bad, but that's also why it's really exciting.
Yeah. But Superman's also very pulpy. Yeah. Superman's very much trying to be a pulp story.
Sure.
Yeah.
It also is something very different.
And those other stories, they're not just imitating the other genres. Sometimes they're plagiarizing other stories.
Straight up plagiarizing things. Yes.
Yeah.
This is like a medium that's trying to find its feet, right? So, across all of the genres, they're throwing stuff at the wall, right? And pilfering like stuff from each other. And, you have like Archie starts, and then suddenly you have like 20 other, teen humor books, right?
And that plagiarizing thing, I know through the publication, like both Marvel and DC were part of larger publishing empires. And I know, Donenfeld, who was the head of DC, and Martin Goodman, who was the head of Marvel, they were buying short stories for their pulps all the time, and in their mind, they owned that, and they would change the author's name and reprint it in a different magazine. So to them, they were adapting that stuff in comics form. It's not plagiarizing; we own it.
Yeah. There's a danger being too rose-colored glasses nostalgic about this era due to its predatory work conditions.
Yes, very much so.
Yeah, one of the things that's in writing a dissertation that becomes hard is, so the two names that everybody knows, or the four names that everybody knows, are Siegel, Schuster, Simon, and Kirby are the ones that people sort of gravitate to, and I guess Kane and Finger.
Not Bob Kane.
I said, and I guess Kane and Finger. Finger should be. But
Kane is gonna rise up out of the grave as a zombie and kill you for saying that.
Yeah,
or he'll have Bill Finger do it for him.
Yes, that's an insider joke.
Yes, but what I found interesting is when I'm doing research, a lot of the names that, and this is true of both the pulps, which I also do work with, and the Golden Age comics, the names of the creative teams are often largely entirely fictional. They just write a name on it, and whoever is writing it that week is just under
or none at all
under that name. Or if they're labeled at all. But there are a lot of them that are just complete fictions as to who the creator is. And that was, and some of them are just like, a lot of times their initials, they're intended to sound literary. So it makes credit hard. But these are, we talk about the way that Siegel and Schuster got screwed out of the $1 billion Superman empire, but that's just how, it wasn't just them. It was work for hire. That's what people did.
Everybody got screwed out of something. Mm-hmm. Theirs is more egregious because of what that character became. But yeah.
Mm-hmm. But also, to get back to action, there's each story is 8 pages, 6 to 12 pages. So eight-ish pages long. And then there's 1-page humor strips in it. It's a remarkable book.
There's like two pages of text in it because for mailing charges, like you had to have text pieces in to get cheaper mailing charges. So most Golden Age comics had text pages. That's where Stan Lee got his start as a writer, was writing the text pages at Marvel.
Mm-hmm. Timely or Atlas or Marvel.
Well, and Martin Goodman look local, so So nepotism at its finest.
One of the other things that I find interesting about the time period is, and this comes up a lot, where this is sort of a pushback against sort of modern comics, or modern comic fans, I should say. Something happens, and I wrote about this briefly in the blog, which is every time I don't like some modern thing because it's just someone who doesn't understand the character just doing violence for violence sake and not, I am not a fan of the Zack Snyder DC movies. I think Man of Steel is awful.
You're not going to get an argument from me there.
Yeah, and I think Batman versus Superman
is so sad.
I thought it was awful until I saw BVS, which I just felt was unwatchable. And I
couldn't watch it because Man of Steel made me too sad. Even as a superhero scholar, I couldn't. It ruined 3 days of my life.
Yeah. So, but what ends up happening there, and this happens with a lot of fans. It's like, well, if you didn't like this movie, you just didn't understand. This is how Superman was back in the day, and you don't understand real comics. And it's like, okay, first off,
Batman used to carry a gun.
Yeah. First off, Batman used to carry a gun. It's like, I'm me. I assure you, I understand all comics better than, with the exception of the 3 people who are on this show right now, 99.9% of the population. Trust me, I've wasted my life on this. Okay.
I guarantee you I've read more comics than most people alive.
Yes. I have trouble remembering my phone number because I know Johnny Quick's speed formula. Okay. This is a problem. So that said, when you say, but Superman was violent back in the day, it's like, he wasn't just violent back in the day. Yeah. He killed people. He wasn't just violent. And yes, he was a different character, but because these are the same people who complain, well, comic books didn't used to be political. It's like, yes, they were. Yeah. They were political for a time period that you don't understand now, which is sort of the point we were making at the very beginning of this episode, where we said one of the reasons we like reading these things is it's really nice to be able to look at 1938 through the lens of 2 young Jewish men living in the projects, just trying to tell this pulp story about a guy who can jump.
I'm writing something about basketball right now, and I have the book right here. It's this book called Jump for Joy, Jazz, Basketball, and Black Culture in 1930s America by Gina Kapani-Taberi. And there was a great little section about Superman in it, and sort of the significance of his ability to jump sort of in the 1930s, and how jumping fits into the culture of the 1930s. Wow. And that significance of him being able to jump over skyscrapers, being unconstrained by the city, which is one of my absolute favorite things about the early Superman comics, sort of his interactions with the city and his interactions with modern technology.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just, it's so, you can read these comics and just see, I mean, it's partly comes from my literary background, I think. I mean, we study a lot of kind of literature from kind of that period and the period between the wars. That's a great period for, American literature, for British literature. So I know some of that cultural context quite well, and sort of that feeds into my reading of some of these early Superman comics and early Batman comics. But yeah, just that fantasy of being able to overcome that urban milieu, and of course the secret identity fantasy as well. As much as it's super sexist, it's sort of like he gets this secret identity just so he can have like a one-up on Lois Lane, kind of, basically.
Yeah. Oh, it's totally, it is totally, particularly once you move on past those early comics where, like, for the first 3 years, Superman or Clark is just really, really upset that Lois doesn't want to fuck him. I mean, that's like literally his character. He's this guy who's grumpy about not being able to get laid. And then once you move towards the end of the Golden Age, and especially during the Silver Age, Superman is a dick. Like, he is just an asshole. And it's just him. Like, every story particularly in Lois's comic, which is called Superman's Girlfriend, Lois Lane, because she was not important enough to have her own identity separate from her boyfriend. But particularly in those stories, he is an ass to her. Like, and she takes it because she always learns the lesson that he's being mean to her for her own good. But that's like half the stories. And why does he hide his identity from her? No good reason, just because he likes fucking with her.
Yeah, I know. And that's definitely present in, like, the 1938 version of Superman.
Yeah.
But there's also a romance to him, too. He's always catching her out of the sky and sort of giving her that freedom of the air to share with him. And she's a very sort of dynamic character in those comics as well.
Yes.
I mean, certainly in terms of, she's not the kind of domesticated woman of the 50s who all she wants is marriage. She's not that character at all in the 30s.
Well, she also wants that. She's weird because she's trans. It's weird to read them. This is when you have to, like, put your 1938 hat on in order to read these books, right? Because we read them. If you read them as a reader in 2020, you're going to, particularly in that first issue, less so by the time she's appearing in like Action Comics 5, 6, she's kind of toned down a bit. But in Action Comics #1, she's bitchy to him. She's just mean to him. And like, and then you like sort of, and you're like, what does he even see in her? Because she barely has any lines, but like all of her lines to him are just mean. Like, she's basically like, you're not a real man, Clark. That's why I don't like you. Like, she actually says shit like that to him. And it's weird. And then she like softens a little bit and she's like, I would give you a chance, but I'm just really into Superman. So it becomes that. But like the fact that she's, in those original comics, her job is, she's not a reporter yet. She's a sob sister. Her job is, she's the woman they hire to write the Lonely Hearts column. And she wants to be a reporter more than anything. She is, the reason she's in danger all the time is because without superpowers, if Lois hears that there's a shootout at the bank, Lois gets up from her desk and runs to the bank to cover it. She's just in the middle of danger because she is not a demure girly girl woman of 1938. In 1938, she's extremely progressive for that. Now it's 2020 now, and so a lot of her, a lot of the stuff where she's just fawning over Superman feels kind of dated, but you have to like think about when they're reading it. For when they're reading and writing it, she's super progressive.
Well, and that coincides with a lot of other things that were happening in representations of women in pop culture during that time. I mean, you had like sort of a surge of empowered women in the 30s that, carried through the war as long as we needed women to be strong. And then obviously, less encouragement in those roles moving forward.
Yep. Yeah, which is probably why, I argue in my dissertation that's part of why the reversal happens in the 50s, in the Silver Age. It's sort of the war's over now, get back in the kitchen and make some babies, is kind of how many of the characters went. And even then, Lois resisted that a lot better than a lot of the other characters did. I don't want to totally throw like Superman's Girlfriend, Lois Lane, the comic book under the bus, because as much as it's super problematic, it's a weird as fuck comic too. So like, this is a comic that also features,
Lois Lane putting on a magic ring to like turn into a Kryptonian insect to defend the Earth while Superman is away. So I mean, it's a complicated comic book.
We're gonna have to do a Silver Age show eventually too, because Lois, of the two, Superman's girlfriend Lois Lane and Superman's pal Jimmy Olsen, I actually like the Lois one better. I think it's an amazing book, but it does have problems.
Yeah, I mean, it's got, Superman spanking Lois for breaking into having his Superman robot spank Lois for breaking into the Fortress of Solitude. And it's got the stuff where she turns into a Kryptonian insect and becomes a superhero. So, complicated.
It also has him fucking his cousin. Yes, that happens. There is a canonical issue of the Lois Lane comic where Superman has sex with Supergirl because the 60s were weird, dude.
You sure you're not thinking about the Tijuana Bible version? I think that's got the sex with Superman and her having sex with her actual father. But
yes, no. There's I don't know if it was saved for the Silver Age show. There's a point where Lois discovers that Superman has a secret wife, and she spends some time trying to figure out who it is, and then it turns out that the secret wife is Supergirl. And they're not actually married. It's just a Supergirl and Superman have both been corrupted by red kryptonite. So they spend 4 days thinking that they are husband and wife, and
shacked red up kryptonite. Though you can't.
But they're shacked up in the Fortress of Solitude.
They were drunk on red kryptonite.
Yeah, for 4 days, telling everybody they're married.
It's on Superman.
Yeah. So. And the comic just said, and they create robot kids, and they're telling everybody they're married for like 4 days till it wears off. And I'm like, they're just hanging out there as husband and wife. Something probably happened.
Yeah, they were like watching television and drinking milkshakes.
Sure, that's exactly
what else would they be doing?
And trying to kill Lois. That's part of the story. But anyway,
we keep diverging into the Silver Age, and we need to talk about more Golden Age comics.
Because I wanted to talk about like the complaint that the same people who complain about, they used to be more violent, blah blah blah, and they weren't political. They were political because I think one of the things that I was talking about when we had that Facebook conversation back when I was complaining was quite possibly my favorite Superman story ever is Superman in the Slums, which is brilliant. Superman in the Slums is a story about Superman discovers, or Clark Kent is basically covering a trial where some kid's been arrested and the judge wants to throw the book at him, and the kid's mother is like, but he's just doing it because we're hungry, we're poor, and he's trying to feed the family. And so Clark goes and investigates, and he finds these people living in the slums of the city, Metropolis, arguably Cleveland, where I'm from. Siegel and Schuster were from Cleveland, so early Metropolis looks a lot like where I'm from.
I just want to interrupt you that if you're not aware, in Canada, we were always told that that Schuster is from Canada.
Really?
We have a Heritage Minute proving this fact with a total false history of Lois being a real person who lives in Canada that inspired the real Lois Lane. This was something that was on television like throughout my childhood. If you ask any Canadian about it, they've seen it.
Wow.
Is it? I mean, did he live there for a little bit that I don't know about, or is it?
Yes.
Schuster did live in Canada. He might have been. I'm forgetting if he was born there or if the family
immigrated. I don't think he was even born here. I think he just lived here for a while when he was a kid.
If you want all the background on Siegel and Schuster, I recommend a book by Brad Ricka called Superboys, and it's basically a biography of them. And so, Schuster spent at least a few years in Canada before moving to Cleveland, but it was well before he would have been taking women to model as characters. That was all done in Cleveland.
Okay. Well, anyway, so he goes to the slums where these kids are living and finds out that there's a whole gang of kids who are basically stealing to help their families make ends meet, and they're paying a fortune to live in these projects which are falling apart. So Superman devises a solution. He tells everybody to leave, and he makes them all go outside the city, the few city blocks where the projects are, and then he just demolishes them by hand. He just knocks over like 4 or 5 city blocks. And they call in the army to stop him, and he's like, "Leave me alone." And he's like, "What?" And he's like, "Well, you can't. You're destroying private property." He's like, "I'm Superman, dude. What are you going to do?" And so they shoot at him, and he doesn't care, and he just wrecks the city, and then they're like, why did you do that? And he's like, now rebuild it. And then he leaves, and and Superman forces the government to rebuild this, rebuild all the crappy property and like let people move back in there to get, because Superman's a massive socialist, and that's just who he is.
That's such a wonderful contrast from, what the stories would be even kind of a year after that, where superheroes become these protectors of private property.
Particularly Batman. Batman is ultra capitalist.
Yeah.
Batman.
I've been reading a lot of early Batman. It's always about rich people and they're murdered because they have jewels or someone wants their money.
Mm-hmm. Batman's all about protecting the factory owners from the criminals. The criminals who are robbing them.
They always have that contradictory thing going on too, where like they'll let a few millionaires die first, just so you can experience that joy, but then he'll save the final one.
Yeah. You want to talk about the crime comics and for a bit? I want to touch on crime and probably romance too.
Before we get into that, let's just a rundown of what all the genres that existed there were, or the best we can name. Because
crime, horror,
romance, funny animals, Western, comedians would have comic books.
Yeah.
Teen
romance comedy.
Yeah, teen romance, which is a little different than romance. That's where that's really Archie developing this whole genre unto itself. Because Archie comics were a little raunchier when they first started. At the very beginning, they're not porn, but they were originally mostly just romance comics. In the blog I published, I posted a picture of like an early picture of Veronica, basically, stunning herself topless, and it's a whole bunch of Archie trying to get laid in those early comics, and then they sort of become a lot more sanitized after the
Westerns. I don't know if we mentioned Westerns. There were a lot of Westerns.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of Westerns.
Science fiction was very popular.
Science fiction. Does Disney count as funny animal, or are they almost a thing unto themselves?
I count that as funny animal, but
technically funny animal, but they're such a juggernaut as well.
Yeah,
those were some of the best selling comics, especially outside the United States.
Mm-hmm.
Where that really cemented the popularity of Donald Duck. Donald Duck is an international icon that we don't understand in the United States. We know who he is here, but he is an icon in like Germany.
Yeah. And we're being very United States centric here, just in general. Like there's a much different comic tradition in Germany, France, Japan, than. I mean, U.S. and Canada are effectively the same country as far as comics go, I think.
We had some of our own comics, especially during World War II, because we couldn't get, anyway, a lot of reasons having to do with the war. But I was going to say before, related to the Superman thing, we had a set of postage stamps of like great Canadian superheroes, and he was included there. We claim him as Canadian. He was included alongside Nelvana of the North and Johnny Canuck and Captain Canuck and all of these wonderful Canadian superheroes that you may or may not know about.
So are there apocryphal stories about Metropolis being based on Toronto or something?
I didn't quite go that far, but I was definitely, I remember having those stamps when I was a kid.
Oh, cool.
Great.
So we had, we should talk about certainly the crime comics and
the horror comics.
Yeah, because those are the ones that essentially end the golden age with Wortham.
Yeah. So,
but they're not ones I like as much. So you go ahead.
well, let's leave what you like for last, because we can happy it back up.
Yeah, for charting kind of the history, you have the 1938 or the 1930s, then the war, and that's for the heyday of superheroes. They're immensely popular because they're all patriotic. But after the war, superheroes become less and less popular. Most of their titles disappear. The last few issues of Green Lantern was actually replaced by Rex the Wonder Dog as the main feature. And actually the only feature, Rex Beyond, the last three issues just feature Rex the Wonder Dog, even though it's a Green Lantern comic.
Captain America's not in his last three issues either.
Yeah. Then there's
Weird Tales.
That's a weird experiment in the 50s when they brought it back and it became Captain America's Weird Tales for 3 issues before it became Weird Tales.
I'm talking about before that. There's a point
even before that one.
Yeah, before he comes, like after the war, Bucky gets shot. Bucky doesn't get blown up. The thing where Bucky got blown up. That's a later invention that gets retconned, but Bucky gets shot. Cap's girlfriend becomes his new sidekick. Golden Girl. Yes. And then those comics stop selling. So Captain America becomes more of an anthology comic. Originally, Captain America was an anthology comic, but all the stories were Captain America. So he starts having backup features, and then he's just having backup features where he's introducing horror stories. And then for like the last 2 of them, he's not even in those. So then he comes back as a commie smasher later. But
as the superheroes die off, you have in the late 40s the rise of the crime and then the horror comics.
Yes. True crime, and which may or may not have been true, but also very much derived from the detective fiction pulp magazines. And there have been some of that stories. Yeah.
There have been some of that since the 1930s, like Crime Does Not Pay, that like crime comics weren't new, but they really came into their own after the war era.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
In part because you had sort of an older audience kind of reading comics that were kind of, expecting some more explicit content. A lot of, people during World War II, soldiers during World War II read comics. And when they come back from the war, they want to continue reading comics.
Well, and I think that's an important point, that there's that perception of comics being for kids. And at the time, that wasn't really true. It was. Kids were reading it, but most of the GIs were reading it. Comics were shipped overseas to the GIs in the millions, probably. And they came back reading that stuff. And like I say, they wanted more adult content. One of the things that Bill Gaines in the Senate subcommittee hearings 54 that didn't go over well is he believed he was publishing comics for adults.
Yes.
And everybody who was grilling him believed they were for kids. And you read those transcripts, you can see they're talking on 2 different levels. They both have different perceptions. That really negatively impacts the way he's perceived.
Even him perceiving that he's publishing comics for teenagers would have been ununderstandable to certain people at the time, right?
Yes.
Comics just were still perceived as like for the under 10s, So like even that you had 15-year-olds reading it that would have been able to understand the satiric humor of EC horror comics, was sort of a controversial idea, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, this is also because of the fact that a teenager was a new idea in the 50s.
Yeah, exactly. That was a major factor in the panic about comic books, for sure.
Thank you, Archie.
In part of why Riverdale's the greatest show ever is that that is a big part of it. The invention of the teenager is very much a postmodern kind of thing. And as far as the idea of even like comics being kid stuff, comics were major media up until the war, because remember, television's not really a thing before World War II. It exists, but no one owns one. People have radios, and you can't take a radio with you. So the entertainment that everybody has is a comic book because they're just cheap. They also have pulp novels, but like cheap books are just sort of that's the TV show of the day, right?
Well, comics are this form of visual culture that is accessible to a mass audience and is a form of popular visual culture that you can consume in private. The way we would watch a movie or something on our phone now was not something people could have done then. If you had a television, it would be a central television in your home. Right? So one of the things, one of the things that were them and the anti-comics crusaders found really threatening about comics was that it was helping nurture this new youth culture, whether it's child culture or whether it's teenage culture, because it was a form of culture that children and teenagers could do outside of the supervision of their parents. And when we think about those anti-comics kind of moral panic news features that sort of ran in the years leading up to the eventual comics code, they're very much framed as that, right? It's like kids reading comics in the woods, just like you would hide your pornography in the woods. And then they're reading it sort of, late at night when they're supposed to be asleep and they're just like vibrating, right? There's a real sexual kind of private subversive thrill to this medium.
There was a TV show. There was a DVD included with one of the books on horror in the 50s that had a 1950s TV show that was anti-comics. And it was they basically showed this group of kids playing in the woods with comics, and they end up torturing this kid because they read a comic. And
I know exactly the one you're talking about. I always show that to my students.
Yeah, it's so over the top and ridiculous, but you're right. It's exactly that. It's like, oh, look what they're getting up to when you're not watching over them.
Yep.
Well, we should. We mentioned we all said the teenagers didn't exist. For the listeners, we mean that quite literally. Before the Second World War, you just had children and then adults, because the concept of a teenager as we know it, I mean, now, obviously, there's a period of time where there were people of a teenage. Yeah, people who are of the age between, 12 and 20 that, but no one used them as separate terms, because you sort of were just under parental supervision until you were old enough to be useful to society and work. And then you got treated more or less like an adult. If you were male, if you were female, until we could marry you off. And
you went into the factories or the farms at a very young age.
Right. And that's kind of, or we sent you to a war. The idea of having teenagers requires, now before the turn of the century, before 1900, this is not an idea that anybody cares about. Being a teenager requires you to have a body developed enough to not, a body and mind developed enough to not need constant supervision, and not in a place that needs you to work. So, you don't live on a farm. You have to live in a city, essentially. And you need transportation, because nobody cares about teenagers when, like, your entire life is within a 3 square mile radius of where you were born, because you have to walk everywhere. Right. Like, once there's cars, that then people who are 16, 17 years old become terrifying, because, they're bigger than you and faster, and they could kill you, like a very. So when we get through this crime comic and horror comic era, we end up at 1954 and a man named Frederick Wortham, who writes a book called Seduction of the Innocent, which terrifies the country that teenagers are going to kill all their parents and also become gay and also rape people. It's all dangers of the world are from comics, according to Frederick Wortham, who, other than that, actually wasn't that bad a guy if you actually look into his life history.
Have you guys done a specific comics code or Frederick Wortham show?
No, before? We haven't. No, we haven't.
I don't know how much you want to get into, because the whole
we've mentioned him, but maybe we'll save that. So
probably. And later in his life, I don't really exactly recanted, but he got into like fanzines and some of that culture and
But anyway, Wortham writes this book, terrifies everybody about comics. And it's the same kind of argument that we've talked about on other shows, where at one point everybody was terrified of Dungeons and Dragons. At one point everybody was terrified of rock and roll, of rap music, of professional wrestling, of video games. It's the kind of thing that we get afraid of. Comics were the thing, and we have these Senate subcommittees, the Senate Subcommittee on Juvenile Delinquency in 1954 and 55, which is where Gaines basically had the testimony that Wayne was talking about earlier.
He's like hopped up on a lot of pills.
Yeah, well, he's hopped up on a lot of pills, which didn't help. Yeah, a lot of Benzedrine.
I think it's also worth mentioning with the Senate hearings that comic books was not their target. They were investigating everything that could promote juvenile delinquency. Yeah. And for them, comics was actually very minor. Mm-hmm. In the comic book industry, this was almost a death blow. So when you talk about comic book history, this is a big event. But for the committee, this was 3 days in New York, and it wasn't that important to them.
Yeah, right. Because the hearings go on for a year. It's just the comics part. I mean, it's just one industry that got destroyed. But essentially, this was people were afraid of teenagers.
Yeah. Well, and just with Max Gaines, not Max, I'm sorry, Bill Gaines, I'm getting to Max, as a publisher of EC Comics, which was one of the ones that was most targeted, because they were in many ways the most adult content in terms of graphic violence and implied sexuality and just overall grossness.
And also a lot of racial diversity in their comics that people did not like at the time.
Yeah. Bill was the son of Max Gaines, who was one of the people who worked for DC Comics national periodicals, and arguably the creator of the comic book format we're talking about. So many of the people working in the industry in the 1950s just did not want to go to those hearings at all. Just, didn't want to be associated with it. So he was brave enough to go and be questioned, and dumb enough to take a lot of Benzedrine ahead of time.
And they fed him to the wolves.
Pretty much.
Because the industry sacrificed him. And EC along with it.
Yeah.
If you want to read a really great recent history of EC Comics that speaks a lot about the racial justice themes within them, I'd recommend Kiana Whithead's recent book, EC Comics, Race, Shock, and Social Protest. It just came out last year.
Okay.
That'll be linked in the show notes.
Yeah, that's one I hadn't heard of. Thank you.
Yeah, so that basically kills it, but it's an interesting time period. And Anna, you said you had a favorite genre from that period.
Favorite? Oh, well, no, I just more like, I don't know. I don't like a lot of the crime comic books because, I mean, the EC stuff is fun because it's satirical. But I mean, there is a lot of stuff from that period that's, there's a lot of like violence against women stuff that Wortham sort of had a right to be concerned about. So if you go back and read all of the crime comics from like the late 40s, early 50s, and you're thinking it's going to be this wonderful site of social protest, you're going to be a little bit disappointed.
Yeah, he wasn't entirely wrong.
Yeah, he wasn't wrong about everything.
He was. It's interesting. It's interesting because if you're a comic book fan, maybe we really should do a Wortham show because we as a culture tend to demonize him. He became comics boogeyman. He was trying to do a good thing and frankly was a good dude in many ways up until this point and after this point.
I mean, this is a guy that's giving out like free psychiatric services like in Harlem that's intensely concerned about racial caricatures in comics, which he had a right to be. Many of the superheroes had like blackface caricature sidekicks at that time.
Yeah. And he, whether he intentionally misled people with his research or not, I think he was just concerned. And he was concerned in the exact same way as in 2020. I don't know what it's going to be in 2020, but as in 2019 or 18, people get concerned about video games or again, the rap music scare or the Dungeons and Dragons scare. People are afraid of, their kids. You know what it is today? Yeah, the kids are on the internet too much. It's going to ruin it. Like those kinds of things.
Cell phones.
Yeah, were the things that this book's about. And he took it a little too far. And also he destroyed an industry that I love.
And I think some of his conclusions were faulty, certainly.
Yes. Yeah.
It's very easy to point to his stuff about homosexuality and Batman and Robin and Wonder Woman being particularly egregious in terms of some wrong conclusions.
Yes. That said, like particularly with the stuff with Wonder Woman, I mean, some of the reasons he was drawing those conclusions weren't too far off base.
Yeah.
No, I mean, his reading of like Wonder Woman being a glorious lesbian who's trying to indoctrinate us all into lesbianism is not wrong. His reading of that as a morbid ideal is wrong.
Yeah.
Right. Right. So it's, it's a complicated issue. And I think that's kind of what makes the Golden Age comics interesting is because they're all complicated. I linked to on the blog. I wrote an article about Solly the Sleuth a while back, which is I still believe that it's quite possible that I'm the only person alive on the planet who's read every issue of Solly the Sleuth. The early Solly the Sleuth are comics about she's the sleuth. She's a detective, arguably, but mostly she's a victim. She's just there to be captured by the bad guys, stripped, arguably raped, and then rescued by her boss. And this goes on for, several years. And then she disappears. And then she comes back. The same guy, same creator, comes back and starts a new series. And she's Olivia Benson from SVU. Like it's fascinating. Like in the new series, she is 100% competent. She goes out and she stops these crimes. There's a famous panel in Wortham's book that just says Jeepers a dame and she's been croaked. That's from a Sally the Sleuth comic.
Oh.
and it's a fascinating look at the Golden Age because I don't know how like in the period when the book wasn't being published, I don't know how it went from this extremely exploitive rape fantasy into a progressive woman police officer story.
The creator obviously got some free therapy from Frederick Wortham.
Yeah. he just goes away for he goes away for a decade and becomes woke, I guess. It's real bizarre.
But that's classic in terms of like those contradictions again of the Golden Age. Because one of the reasons, it's exciting in much the same way like pre-code movies are exciting, right? Mm-hmm. We do have these sort of glimpses of like female liberation and deviant sexuality and things that are very exciting to see in comic books, especially after the Comics Code really cracked down on. I mean, one of the things the Comics Code tried to regulate was, gender representation and sexuality, right? We couldn't have any non-normative sexualities, and we had to have traditional gender representations, marriage above all, that kind of thing. Whereas in the Golden Age, there's so many superheroes that have and again, it's usually a female sidekick with a more diminutive name, Rocket Man, Rocket Girl, that kind of thing. Catman and the Kitten, which is so adorable that I'm going to forgive it. At the same time, when I'm reading these comics, there's a wonderful, again, subversive sexuality about them where you have this male and female superhero. They usually wear kind of a matching costume and have matching powers, and they just go on adventures together. And that's kind of wonderful. And it's not something you would see again in that way for quite a long time.
Well, the Silver Age period essentially codifies and enforces a fictional gender ideal from, and remember, Silver Age starts in the mid 50s, but it very much sort of codifies this perfect gender ideal from the 1930s that didn't even really exist then. like it very much, everything has to be about marriage. It's very much if you think the Hollywood production code, where you don't even want to see people kissing if they're not married. It is so sanctified.
Ozzy and Harry with their separate beds.
Yeah, separate beds, that sort of thing. It is so sanctified. It is so pristine. And the very idea of deviant sexuality, which is, or aberrant sexuality, essentially being gay, is anathema after, because there's a lot of, again, Wortham's not wrong about Wonder Woman comics. It is very, very heavily implied that she's bisexual. That's arguably the point of his version of the book.
Inspired by Marston's research at sorority initiation rituals.
Right. And then that goes away, and it just becomes about her pining for, to be a wife. It becomes so bizarre after this period's over. And what makes it fun for me to look back is just thinking, the comics industry has never been, the mainstream comics industry has never been that huge in the Golden Age. This is like 20 guys living in New York, basically writing all these books. And the things that they were trying to do when they were trying to be interesting and trying to be subversive from a very different time period point of view is just fascinating to me. So I think they're worth reading.
I can't believe that Wortham went after Batman and Robin for being gay and totally missed Hydro Man and Rainbow Boy. A creation of Bill Everett, who also did Submariner, who seemed to have a thing for water-based heroes.
The things that I don't know. I'm not going to link Seduction of the Innocent in the show notes. Find it yourself. Because I can't. I've read Seduction of the Innocent. I've read it all, and it's an, I'm going to use the word interesting read.
you should do a show on it. It's worth a show.
Yeah. But there's so much interesting stuff going on. I didn't even talk about this is the rise. This time period is the rise of good girl art. And if you think that the 90s comics of, your Witchblade and I don't know, Danger Girl, what are the other bad girl art books, Wayne?
Lady Death,
all those books. Yeah, then you've never read Sheena Jumbo comics.
And there were more Jungle Girls than you could shake a tiger at.
I spent again finishing up this chapter of my dissertation, I spent the last 3 weeks reading a large portion of all the Sheena comics, the Golden Age Sheena comics, and they're amazing. Sheena is a warrior. They're problematic in that, she's a blonde white woman who is, when she's 6 years old, her father is an explorer and he's exploring uncharted Africa because Africa is always savages. And he makes friends with a medicine man, hangs out there for a month. And then he's ready to leave, and the medicine man doesn't want him to leave, so he kills him. And then he feels bad about killing him, and so he raises Sheena to be the new queen of their tribe because everybody loves her because she's white. Literally, that's the reason it's given. They're amazed by her. They're amazed by her white skin. So then This
was years before she became a punk rocker.
Then she grows up becomes like the queen of this jungle. And then this other explorer comes along, and wow, there's this hot white woman in charge of all the Africans. So he falls in love with her. She falls in love with him. And it's weird because Sheena is this weird comic where rather than where at this point where most male characters are trying to, sort of tame their even Steve Trevor wants Wonder Woman to retire, which is stupid because without Wonder Woman, he'd be dead. She saves him constantly, but he wants her to retire and marry him. Sheena and Bob has no interest whatsoever in taming Sheena. He loves that she's wild and he doesn't want to marry her. He doesn't want to go back to America. He's perfectly happy to be her sidekick. They go and they kill poachers and then they fuck. That's the story. Yeah. and it's real clear that that's what they're doing. You don't actually see them have sex, but it's a lot of we're going to kill people and now we're going to go back. We're going to kiss and go back to our treehouse. And she's half naked and she's deadly. And it's crazy. And it's a crazy book that is fascinating because you go, how was this written in the 40s? Because you expect it to not be that, but it was. Sheena, Phantom Lady, a lot of books like that.
Namor's comics are some of my favorite Golden Age ones. He's Namor from day one and is fabulous from day one.
And a dick.
Oh, he's such a dick, but he's a rogue, and the ladies love him.
He's also, it's a very, even from the very beginning, Namor is one of the weird female gaze oriented books.
He is right from the beginning too. It's like I'm not kidding about the ladies loving him. It's a little bit like Man from U.N.C.L.E., where there's often sort of a new woman in each comic that like he sort of helps out and gets to have a little adventure with him and then return to her normal world at the end.
Yeah, so I guess we've resolved nothing. I don't know what there was to resolve. We resolved that the Golden Age was weird.
It was.
We resolved that Namor was sexy since day one.
He is.
So there is that.
We brought up the idea that this was such an experimental time that they were partly just figuring out what a superhero is, but for all the comic books, it was, what is this format? What is this genre? What can we do with this type of art and sequential storytelling? And I want to read a quote from Daniel J. Borston. I'll track down which volume of his it is, but he's talking about American folklore. He says, 2 crucial distinctions mark the American making of a popular legendary hero. First, there was a fantastic chronological abridgment from elusive oral legend to print form required here a few years rather than centuries. Legends hastened into print before they could be purified of their vulgarities and localisms. Second, the earliest printed versions were in distinctly American form. David Crockett was not written down in any American counterpart of the Historia Reginum Britannia or in any Mort d'Arthur. And what we see in the comic books is that abridgment brought down even more. There's not even an oral tradition. It's just all going right into print and they figure it out afterwards. And it's fascinating to read those early stories in that context.
Mm-hmm. And you read about how that stuff was produced. I mean, you would have, a room full of 12 guys who would produce an entire comic over a weekend.
And by produce, you mean from inception to coloring?
Yeah, right, draw, ink, do color, do the lettering, and turn it in on Monday morning.
That's how you come up with the moth.
And by an entire comic, you're talking 64 pages, not these 20 pages we get nowadays.
Yeah, and it's insane, but there's story after story of comics being produced on that type of schedule. So that throwing anything against the wall, that's because they were all sleep deprived and drunk. Much like people working on their dissertation.
Yeah.
So
well, I want to thank both of our guests for being here. That was a great conversation.
Yeah, that was really great.
Thank you.
Always happy to talk comics, especially weird comics.
Well, you're both welcome back anytime. Yes. John, where do people find more of you?
I am an occasional guest on the Protagonist podcast hosted by my brother, Joseph Darowski. Since we're talking about the history of comic books, I'm also going to recommend the Ages of Superheroes series from McFarlane Comics, which my brother edits, and I've had an essay in every volume. So you can find me there.
Nepotism.
Yes, somehow it works.
Just like Martin Goodman.
I'm actually in the next one.
I'm also going to recommend that if you want a good Golden Age comic, go track down Action Comics number 12 with Superman Declares War on Reckless Drivers.
I was going to bring that one up earlier. It's one of my favorites.
So great.
So yeah, everyone go check that one out.
It's so great.
As someone who walks everywhere in cities and almost gets run over like once a week, I really appreciated that comic.
It's exactly what it sounds like too. It's like there's nothing like you should read it.
It's not subtle at all.
There's no surprises. This is like the title tells you what this book's about. Superman doesn't like you if you run red lights. That's the book.
And he will like threaten to kill you.
Yeah. Anna, where will we find you?
I am a featured panelist on a podcast called 3-Panel Contrast. You can find us wherever you find your podcasts. We're a comics podcast. We're 3 academics that talk about various comics. We usually have a theme every week. And we've got some fun episodes coming up that I don't want to spoil anything right now, but you can check us out at 3-Panel Contrast on Twitter, wherever you find your podcasts. On Twitter, we're at #3-Panel Contrast. And
you had a recent episode that compared in depth, fascinatingly, Uncle Scrooge of the Golden Age to Howard the Duck.
Yes, we had a Duck Space podcast. It's usually our panel member, Michael, that chooses those pairings. Mine are usually boring superhero ones, but he always picks a weird one, and they usually work out well.
That's a good one.
And other than that, I mean, I write a lot of stuff about gender, sex, and superheroes. I've got a book coming out in the fall called Super Sex, Sexuality, Fantasy, and the Superhero. It's an anthology all about super sex. So people can look out for that, although it won't be coming out for like 9 months. So that's not a very good plug.
We'll have you back.
Have me back to talk about sex and superheroes then.
That's literally all I do every day of my life right now. Like I said, dissertations are... Anyway, Wayne, how can people find you?
Mostly through the show these days.
Yeah,
that's it. Yeah, I know. I have a blog with. If you've never read my blog before, there are dozens and dozens and dozens of entries on a wide variety of topics. I just haven't added anything new to it in ages.
And you can follow me on my blog at www.chrismaverick.com or on Twitter at Chris Maverick. You can follow this show on our blog at www.voxpopcast.com and on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram, all at Vox Popcast. If you enjoy this show, and we certainly hope you do, please subscribe to us on iTunes or Stitcher or Spotify or wherever the hell else you get podcasts from. And do us a favor, write us a 5-star review, especially on Apple Podcasts or iTunes or whatever they call it. If you can write us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, that tricks the algorithm into making people think that we are more important and more famous than we really are, which is good for us. Doesn't do much for you, but it's good for us. And we will read your name on the show. We will thank you profusely and you'll make our day. It'll be like the golden age of podcasting. It's a great idea. And I would like to thank Maximilian of thoughtForm Music for our epic theme song, building ever so more epically and playing us out. I'd like to thank our guests once again for joining us. I'd like to thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye.
The real question is this: are comic books good or are they not good? If you want to raise a generation that is half stormtroopers and half cannon fodder with a dash of illiteracy, then comic books are good. In fact, they are perfect.